title of this mini lecture is called That's in the Constitution. You all have copies of the Constitution, and there are seemingly arcane clauses in there. And you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, we might think when we read the news or we read the newspaper, listen to the news, that there are only a few exciting clauses in the Constitution. Certainly the Commerce Clause is that clause that has been in the news most recently with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act being upheld, not under the Commerce Clause, but as a tax by the Supreme Court. And we certainly talk about or think about the 14th Amendment, which, as I said in an earlier lecture, passed in the wake of Reconstruction after the Civil War to create new limits on states. And we certainly think of the sexier parts of the Bill of Rights, right? Freedom of religion, freedom of expression, right? The right against unreasonable searches and seizures. But there are other clauses that are admittedly arcane, but are nevertheless as binding as those more interesting clauses. And I want to talk about three of those this morning. Letters of marque and reprisal, bills of attainder, and titles of nobility. Almost everything you always wanted to know about these clauses, but were afraid to ask. So let's start with letters of marque and reprisal, which are granted to Congress. This power to grant letters of marque and reprisal are granted specifically to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, but explicitly denied to the states in Article 1, Section 10. This seemingly arcane term is part of Congress's, but not the President's, overall war power. Sovereign nations are the ones that grant letters of marque and reprisal to private parties. And this is very common in the 18th and early 19th century, to private parties called privateers, to authorize them to seize goods or possessions of nations with which they are at war. The power isn't really in any significant sense exercised today, although if you are out in the open seas without a letter of marque and reprisal, by definition you are a pirate. But they were issued often, particularly during the Revolutionary War. The vast majority of seizures by the Americans of British possessions were carried out through the granting of letters of marque and reprisal. And that's interesting in and of itself. And what I want to suggest about these three parts of the Constitution that are seemingly arcane, though, is that they still have a lot to teach us about the overall structure of American constitutionalism. Because as I said before, this power to grant letters of marque and reprisal to private entities in the service of war power is specifically granted to Congress, but denied to two other groups. Well, individually denied to the President, and also denied to the states. So only Congress can authorize or exercise or authorize, I should say, letters of marque and reprisal. Only Congress. Congress also has the power to declare war. So while this clause might seem arcane and really non-operative today in any significant sense, as it was in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it certainly suggests, more generally, that the overall war power was imagined by the framers to be conducted or decided upon by Congress and not the President. We have, in the 20th century, ceded more and more power to the executive branch in terms of war-making powers. Congress over and over and over again has done this, and both parties have done this. Although we tried to rein in the power that we had given the chief executive, the President, in the early 1970s, after Vietnam, or as Vietnam was winding down, it still really didn't have any teeth. We've kind of moved away from that. Whether that's good or bad is not the subject here. What is important to understand, though, is that even though letters of marque and reprisal are seemingly outdated, they are part of the framers' larger wish or understanding, right, and structure of the Constitution that imagines that Congress would declare war, and that would be part of declaring war. The President, as Commander-in-Chief, might carry out certain functions of war, but the ultimate power would rest with Congress. So again, while this is arcane, it certainly speaks to issues of separation of powers and checks and balances, right? The seemingly arcane notion of letters of marque and reprisal, without which you would be considered a pirate. We also see in two parts of the Constitution this mention of bills of attainder, and even a phrase called corruption of blood. These are in Article 1, Section 9, and then again in Article 3. Bills of attainder are legislative determinations of guilt or innocence of a particular group or persons. In other words, the Congress is prohibited from deciding generally that you personally are guilty of something. That is a function, the Constitution says, that courts should carry out, not legislative branches. They should not carry this out. Attainders, particularly though, are capital crimes. In other words, crimes that are punishable by death. So any kind of crime that's going to be punishable by death can only be legitimate, or you can only be found guilty of it, if the judicial branch of the government finds you guilty. It's not something that we want the Congress to go around doing, but particularly they were afraid of the way bills of attainder had been carried out in the past, particularly in England, where Parliament would find particular individuals guilty, let alone whole groups of people. And again, the basic idea here is twofold. Legislatures are limited in their power, which is a concept that permeates the Constitution. Every branch is limited in its power. But it's especially limited in creating criminal legislation that's particular to specific individuals or classes of individuals. And the other side of that, then, which is another concept that just permeates the Constitution, is that the judiciary be independent and impartial. And they are the proper branch of government for deciding guilt or innocence. But while Congress is prohibited from passing general bills of attainder, they could be issued for treason. Bills of attainder can be issued for treason, which brings us to a related and no less surprising clause in Article 3, which is this corruption of blood charge. And that is simply this. If you're found guilty of treason, you're found guilty, and most likely you'd be put to death. But the concern of the founders with this phrase, corruption of blood, was that your guilt as a treasonous citizen would not be visited upon your family. This was an idea in terms of political philosophy that the framers had understood. John Locke, the famous 17th century political philosopher, said that when one country conquers another, there are people who are going to be found guilty of crimes. That's just part of what happens in the world when one country takes over another. But the families in the second generations of those who were responsible for an atrocity or something should not have punishment visited upon them. So again, I mean, it might seem strange and arcane that we would have this term which prohibits the corruption of blood. In other words, that prohibits the punishment of treason to visit anybody in that guilty person's family. But it was still a concern. Well, what does this have any import for us? It has great import for us. Again, this is about limited government. The Constitution creates a government and empowers it, but at the very same time, it limits it. It has the power to punish treason, but it can only go so far. It is limited to the person who is charged or found guilty of treason. It cannot go further than that. And the final thing, there are many other seemingly arcane terms in the Constitution, but the final one that I want to talk about in this lecture is the prohibition against the granting of titles of nobility. And the origins of the clause are straightforward. You know, just a decade and a half before, we had fought a revolution against a monarchy. We were a republican government, we imagined, one that came from the people, was justified, and its legitimacy came from the people. The government, or the people themselves, would rule over themselves. There would be no king. There would be no divine right of kings. We're going to repudiate that. Monarchy is gone. But to get the feeling of just how serious Americans were about this clause, the eminent historian Jack Rakov, who's been to OU many times, and I encourage you to go see him when he comes back again, found this quip about Vice President John Adams, who just in an occasional way, in a very informal way, suggested that the President of the United States be referred to as His High Mightiness. Not his kingship, but just his high mightiness. But considering that Adams was Rubenesque, or short, and very fat, his critics suggested not only that that was incorrect and wrong, but that Adams would be referred to as his rotundity. So the founders were dead serious about this idea, not only theoretically, but practically as well. And the fact that there would be that kind of exchange between and among founders, and how quickly some would jump on another for even suggesting that somebody might be considered worthy of being elevated, high mightiness, shows just how concerned the founders were with a republican as opposed to a monarchical government. So again, while these phrases, clauses, sections of the Constitution are seemingly arcane and sometimes aren't even applicable anymore in any kind of real sense, they don't have any traction or traction enough to be sexy in the news or come before the Supreme Court. When you look at them a little closer, you can see that they really do represent foundational principles of American constitutionalism: separation of powers, limited government, and a government that is founded upon the legitimacy of the people and no one else. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from Woody Young and the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.